Ones that are successful loved what they did so they could persevere. So you got to love it, you got to have passion.
In the United States, after the end of World War II, there was a democratically elected president of Iran named Mossadegh, and he was determined to rein in the exploitation by foreign oil companies. In this case, it was particularly what's become BP, British Petroleum. The Americans were deeply involved. The British and the Americans decided that they somehow had to end Mossadegh's career as prime minister, even though he'd been democratically elected. Eisenhower was president at the time. He was very fearful of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And of course, Iran is right on the border with the Soviets. So he was very fearful, and his Secretary of State and head of the CIA, the Dulles brothers, Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, they were real hawks, and they wanted to end Mossadegh's reign, but they also were afraid of nuclear war. So they decided to try something new. They sent in a CIA agent named Kermit Roosevelt, and Roosevelt went in with suitcases full of money. Literally. And it was so successful. So a decision was made not long after that to employ private consultants to do this sort of work. If I was caught and somehow condemned for what I was doing, it would be easy to say, well, he just works for this private corporation. Government doesn't sanction these sorts of things. This was another highlight in developing the economic hitman approach to use debt, enslavement, rather than military.
Sense the Dollars back with another incredible episode. I've got the one and only John Perkins. He's on here to discuss a vast variety of things. He's an author, activist, and speaker. He's a former economic hitman, and I'm bringing him on to sort of give us a breakdown of the reality and nature of how things work politically behind the scenes so we can have a better grasp of the true nature of things. John, absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you for doing this. And as I mentioned before we got on, I've been a fan for several years now. I've been watching your stuff, watching the talks that you've given, whether it's been the TED Talks, the podcast. I've read the book. Then I think it was the second edition of the Economic Hitman, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Mind blowing, and I'm sure you got that response a lot. So before we sort of kick things off, do you want to just sort of walk us through what does it mean to be an economic hitman, and of course, how did you become one? More importantly.
Well, yeah. So my thanks, Mickey. My official title was Chief Economist at a major Boston-based U.S. consulting firm. But my job and that of my staff was to identify corporations. Identify countries that have resources that our corporations wanted, like oil. And today, it's more likely to be the green business backed. Minerals and metals like lithium and cobalt and the things that are necessary for the greening of the economy. But in any case, we identify these countries and then arrange a huge loan to the country. In the case of the United States, we did it through the World Bank or its sister organizations. Today, increasingly, it's being done by China, which is what the third book in the Economic Hitman trilogy, which is just out, talks about is China's economic hitman. They do it through their BRICS Bank or the AIIB Bank or one of their other AIIB Bank or one of their other banks. But you raise a huge loan and the country never actually sees the money. The money is immediately deposited in the account of some major corporation in our country. And it's used to build infrastructure projects in that country. So the country gets the loan, it's backed by collateral, which is the oil or other precious resource that we use as collateral. The money goes to a U.S. corporation or a Chinese corporation to build big infrastructure projects in the country. Things like power plants and industrial parks, highways, ports, things that benefit a few wealthy families who own the industries that benefit from this infrastructure. Of course, the biggest beneficiaries are the U.S. corporations or that build these plants that make big profits. A few people in the country that takes out the loan benefit, the ones that own the industries, but the majority of the people actually suffer because money is diverted from healthcare, social education, and other social services to pay off the interest on the loan. And in the end, the loan usually can't be repaid in full. And so we go in, usually under the mandate of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to restructure the loan. And that means implementing what are called neoliberal economics, which means the country needs to sell its precious resource, it's the collateral, still in the ground basically, oil, mineral, whatever, to our corporations at cut rate prices without many environmental or social regulations, drop taxes on the rich, deregulate, privatize their public sector businesses like utility companies and water and sewage systems, things like that. And so basically what we've done is we've got the country now almost as a servant of ours. We've managed to put the country deep into debt, and we can dictate a lot of policies to that country.
Incredibly interesting. And I think people don't realize, and I think I've heard you say this, so I think many people have this impression that countries and power is taken by way of military means, weaponry, that sort of thing. But I've heard you speak a lot to the fact that it's actually debt that makes the greatest impact. But before we unpack that, how does one get into the field of even becoming an economic hitman? Like, I've never seen a job posting for it. I wouldn't even know where to apply. So how did it start for you? I mean, did you grow up as somebody that had interest in becoming one? I can't really imagine that. How did
Yeah, not at all. When I graduated from business school, I went in the Peace Corps for 3 years and was stationed in Ecuador, mainly in the Amazon basin area with indigenous people. But when I got out, I was offered this job, this consulting firm, and really I didn't have very good credentials. I had a Bachelor of Science degree in business administration, and I said to them, they said, "We want to hire you as an economist," and I said, "Well, I don't think I qualify." And they said, "Well, we've had some people that are very qualified, but that we had a PhD in economics. We had 2 guys with MBAs." And they couldn't do the job because the one of them was sent to Panama. He ended up tying himself to a tree in the center of town in a small city in rural Panama, setting fire to himself, basically trying to set fire to himself.
Oh, wow.
The police took him away, put him on a plane back to the United States, and we had to institutionalize him. The other people went off to countries like Indonesia and Colombia and said they couldn't write reports, the economic reports we wanted because the data wasn't there. They didn't have the statistics, and they couldn't write the reports. So I was told, and I had been communicating with the senior vice president of this company that hired me, who had been in Ecuador developing a project there, and a year before I left, I'd met with him, and he'd asked me to send him reports about what was going on in the country. Well, I love to write. That's my point. I love to write. So I sent him some very good reports. And he said, "Well, now we know you can write a report. We know you don't need a lot of data. So we know you don't have that problem. We also know you can survive in another country. You've lived in the Amazon and in the Andes for 3 years. So I think you're qualified for the job."
Unbelievable.
They sent me off to Indonesia, my first assignment. I was trained by this remarkable woman named Claudine, who you could go into if you want to, but her training was pretty impressive. And then very shortly, I was sent off to Indonesia, and I wrote a great report. And I did a really, really good job, and I convinced the country to accept a large loan from the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank and do what I'd been sent there to do. And I have to say, Mickey, that at the beginning, all along, I thought I was doing the right thing for many years, because in business school, we're taught, and the World Bank produces a lot of reports that say that to help a country grow its economy, you need to invest in big infrastructure projects, take out big loans, you use your resources, collaterals, and invest in these big infrastructure projects, and your economy will grow. And statistically, we can show that it does grow. But over time, I began to realize that the growth, GDP really measures how well the wealthy people are doing, how well the corporations are doing, and the big agribusinesses, and on and on. It does not measure the prosperity of the majority of the people.
Was there a specific almost turning point? I mean, once you got in, did it take time for it to sort of unravel and for you to realize and say, wait a second, something's starting to feel off? Because I've heard you say this, and I would also imagine once going from somebody that feels that they're not particularly qualified to all of a sudden being sort of given this level of authority, producing these reports, getting commended for it probably, It must have been a little bit of a good feeling. So I'm assuming at the beginning there, things were on the up and up. Maybe you were getting the things that you wanted and the feeling that you wanted out of working in this career path. But what was the actual turning point where you started to take a look around and say, wait a second, there's more to this?
Well, I think the fact that I'd been in the Peace Corps and been on the downside with living with the poor people helped. But also, I began, I speak Spanish, so I would hear from the people in the street. I didn't just get the information that so many American businessmen and consultants in those days got. They didn't speak the language, and all they got the information was through interpreters that had studied in American schools and kind of brainwashed. And one person in particular, Chorijos, who was the head of state of Panama, befriended me. He was a party animal, and he invited me to parties. I hung out with him, and he used to say to me, John, don't you realize that you're selling a lie and you're lying to yourself? What you're doing in these countries is not helping the majority of the people. You're just helping the rich get richer and the poor getting poorer. And then I began to look at how we measure these statistics. And Mickey, I'll give you one easy back of the envelope. I kind of heard that from my own mind at the time, that it's a little different now than it was then, but basically the situation today is that 3 individuals in the United States, 3 individuals have as much money as half the population of the United States.
Wow.
And if those 3 individuals last year made 10% on their wealth, and half the country lost 3%, and the rest of the country remained stable, it'd show a growth of almost 4%. And so it looked like the whole country had benefited, when in fact only 3 individuals and their families had benefited, while everybody else had either lost or remained the same. And if that's true in a country where 3 individuals own as much wealth as half the population, what about in a country where 3 or 1 individual owns as much wealth as 90% of the population?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It's not necessarily just individuals, one family. And I began to see that our statistics, the metrics that we use, are skewed toward the rich, are skewed towards supporting this really colonialistic endeavor that we call foreign aid. And that's not to say that all foreign aid is bad. Some of it's this good, but a lot of it is used in the way I've described.
Of course, and it's a common theme, and it continues to persist, I would say, and I would sort of tie it to this concept, and I'm sure you've heard it come up in the media probably, but this idea of virtue signaling, which is now we live in a time in which people speak on the things that they think people want to hear, more so than doing the things that actually need to be done. And that disguises actual actions and behavior, and that's what it's starting to sound like. It's almost as if they would sell it based on these fancy words and the idea that this would help the entire country as a whole, the people. But in reality, was putting them into debt and in a position where they knew full blown, I'm assuming, when the loans were given. So by the way, actually, let's walk through that. So what was the process like? You guys would identify a country. I would imagine it would be a country that, isn't particularly quote unquote first world, somebody that's kind of still trying to make it out to develop further. And once the country's identified, what would happen from there? What's the actual process like?
Well, we would know that this country has these vast resources and not the technology or the finances to develop the resources on their own. They needed help from someone else. And in those days, it would be either the Soviet Union or us, or maybe France or England or other countries that had technology to drill for oil, whatever the resource was. But we'd go into the country and say, hey, essentially what I would say is, look, Mr. President or Minister of Finance, in this hand, I've got a few $1 billion to invest in your country. You got to hire our companies to do it. And you and your friends are going to make a lot of money off this. Or if you choose not to go this route, in this hand, I've got a gun. I didn't actually carry a gun. But I knew, and the president knew, that there were people behind me we call jackals, who, are CIA assets or one of the organizations.
Yeah.
And, the United States has a long history of overthrowing presidents that don't support our policies. or assassinated them. Allende in Chile, and Arbenz in Guatemala, and Mossadegh in Iran, and Diem in Vietnam, Lumumba in the Congo. In 2009, more recently, Zelaya in Honduras. And so these presidents know that goes on. And so, what would you do, Mickey? What would your listeners do? You go, well, here, I can make you rich.
Yeah.
Or
yeah. I mean, it would take a specific kind of it would take an individual with a lot of integrity, a lot of courage to almost resist that type of offer. Essentially, it sounds like a Godfather-esque kind of offer, right? It's an offer they can't refuse. And so when you would go out there and make the offers, what was essentially the success rate from your experiences in making those offers?
Extremely high.
Okay.
My job was actually relatively easy. And then I would write a glowing report that would show that if this country invested in these things, its economy would increase. And the implication always was everybody's going to be better off over the next 20 years. We'd show growth rates. An example, if you invested in the electrical sector and it's going to grow at let's say 7 or 8% a year, you show the economy is not going to grow at 12 or 15% a year. And that's probably true if you measure it by GDP. But all that electricity was going to a few wealthy people in their factories and their businesses. It wasn't going to the campesinos in those days were still without electricity. Today, there's a lot more electricity in places. People have cell phones and so on, but there's still this huge gap in between the wealthy and the poor. People may have cell phones, they may have televisions, but they're living in houses that are built on toxic waste sites and using toxic materials. That they're eating food that's not nourishing. There's a whole the whole scenario there that's not as it appears. So we'd go in and make these offers, and at the same time, these heads of state would know that if they didn't accept, they were probably going to face some pretty dire circumstances.
Yeah. Wild. Now, by the way, it sounds it's obviously been a very successful quote unquote business model. And can we sort of pin it? Like, what was the originating moment? Where did it come from? Who decided on it? Was it something that's always been in motion? Was there a specific moment, better yet, that the U.S. and its private contractors figured this out and applied it?
Yes, I talk in this third in the Economic Hitman trilogy series about how there's four pillars of the Economic Hitman strategy, 4 pillars, and they're fear, and fear of military invasion usually, or fear of somebody else invading you, and therefore you've got to come with us because we'll protect you. Debt, 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 which is what we've been talking about. Anxiety over scarcity, which means, well, there are too many poor people. We've got to do something to improve their lot, or at least we got to say we're doing something to improve their lot. And divide and conquer. You're either with us or you're against us, and you better join our forces so that we can protect you and do these things for you. And historically speaking, those 4 pillars have been in place for a very long time. It goes back to the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, the Chinese empires of antiquity. And military force was a big one throughout history. In the United States, after the end of World War II, there was a democratically elected president of Iran named Mossadegh, and he was determined to rein in the exploitation by foreign oil companies. In this case, it was particularly what's become BP, British Petroleum. The Americans were deeply involved. The British and the Americans decided that they somehow had to end Mossadegh's career as prime minister, even though he'd been democratically elected. And Eisenhower was president at the time. He was very fearful of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And of course, Iran is right on the border with the Soviets. So he was very fearful, and his Secretary of State and head of the CIA, the Dulles brothers, Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles. They were real hawks, and they wanted to end Mossadegh's reign, but they also were afraid of nuclear war. So they decided to try something new. They sent in a CIA agent named Kermit Roosevelt, who was Teddy Roosevelt's grandson. And Kermit Roosevelt went in with suitcases full of money, literally, and a few assistants. And he managed to convince a lot of people in the police and many other in the unions and so forth. He managed to get people out on the streets demonstrating against Mossadegh. And to make a long story short, he overthrew Mossadegh. He actually got the Iranian people. The purchase of Mossadegh was unpopular, which wasn't true, but it looked that way. And it was so successful that it was seen, well, this is a good way to go. We don't need to spend a lot of money on military. We don't need to risk war with the Soviet Union. This is what we can do. The problem, and this is in the early 50s, the problem was that Roosevelt was a CIA agent. He was an employee of the CIA. Had he been caught, it would have been very embarrassing for the U.S. government. So a decision was made not long after that to employ private consultants, private firm to do this sort of work. If I was caught and somehow condemned for what I was doing, it would be easy to say, well, he just works for this private corporation. He's not connected with it. The U.S. government doesn't sanction these sorts of things. But we can date all of this kind of back to that. And then after the Vietnam War, when we realized that the military wasn't doing a very good job. It didn't work in Vietnam. This was another highlight in developing the economic hitman approach to use debt, enslavement, rather than military.
Yeah, and it's proven to be quite successful. And by the way, so just to the Iran thing, so when they flipped that, was the intention to put in the Shah, essentially? I would imagine so. I mean, he was their guy. And so what happened there? Did they lose control of the situation where he sort of kind of decided to fly his own path? Like, what caused him not to fall in line specifically? Because I would imagine there was more that happened with the revolution behind the scenes.
Yeah, the CIA brought the Shah in. I mean, he'd been there before. He'd fled to Iraq. He was in disgrace, and when Mossadegh was overthrown, they brought in the Shah and he took over. The CIA always supported him. The U.S. military supported him. I spent a lot of time during the 70s in Iran. I had an office there. I knew the Shah. It sort of worked for the Shah, in that sort of way, indirectly. And I think it's kind of mysterious how little we understood that the Shah there was this underlying resentment of the Shah. We all thought he was very popular, and we were working with him, and he was supporting our selling oil to us and investing heavily. We didn't have to convince him to take loans. He had the money. What we had to convince him to do was to hire us to develop his country, build power plants and highways and all these things that we made a lot of money off of to protect him against the Soviets. Basically, we said, they're right on your border. You need us to keep them out. So, use your oil money to hire our companies. And he was very good at that. I don't think, and I've talked to CIA agents who were there at the time, that they didn't understand what was happening. It's kind of remarkable, but very few people spoke Farsi, the Iranian language. I didn't speak it, and we all counted on and translators, interpreters, in every meeting that we were in. And they were all, of course, worked for the Shah, and one way or another, or one of his agencies, and they'd been trained in schools in the United States and England, and they were part of the system. So I think we got a lot of misinformation. And I think the CIA got a lot of information. I think everybody was shocked at how quickly this guy went down, and what a strong undercurrent of resentment there was on the part of people who then supported the mullahs.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I agree with you. I know that one probably shocked a lot of people that I've spoken to that have family or have lived through it kind of say the same thing, because it seemed like people did love the Shah. And it just shows you, as much control as they may think the U.S. and its agents and assets think that they may actually have, sometimes if you don't have the language and you don't have your actual pulse on things, you can miss critical information, which I'm sure is probably what happened. But if we fast forward a little bit, because you mentioned the high success rate with the whole economic hitman strategy, what were the scenarios, or what was a time in which it didn't actually work for you when you went out there and you did your bidding and it was flat out rejected?
Well, I'll get into that, but
yeah,
going back to Iran for just a moment.
Yeah, and of course, we could stay there.
It was interesting that, so in 1978, I was at the Hotel Intercontinental, the best hotel in Iran. I was living a very luxurious life, frankly, and I'm sitting in the bar one night, and I get a tap on the shoulder, and it's a guy named Fahad who I'd gone to college with. We'd been good friends in college, and his father was a general in the Shah's military, and I hadn't seen him, Fahad, in 10 years. And he taps me on the shoulder, and we have a little conversation, and very quickly he says, "You and I are flying to Rome together tomorrow morning on the Air France, or the early morning Air France flight." And I said, no, I have an important meeting tomorrow. And he said, "No, I've got your ticket. You're going with me." And and I said, "Well, why?" He said, "Yeah, the country is not like you think it is. It's going to be very dangerous here tomorrow. In the next few days, you're coming with me." And I said, "Well, what about your dad?" And he said, "My dad's living in Rome. We're going to go stay at my dad's house." And I said, "Wait, he works for the Shah?" "No longer." He said, "He's left. He knows that it's over. The Shah's reign is over. We're getting out of here." And I did. I flew out with him, and it was the next day that things began to erupt, and they just got worse and worse. It was 1979 and that whole period, and then we had the hostage situation and so on. So, but that just goes, I was totally naive. I had no idea. This was a shocking thing to me. And when I went to his dad's house and met with his dad and in Rome, the next few days, his dad said that, the Shah's not who we thought he was, and it's over. And the people are very unhappy with him. The whole Middle East is in the process of changing. We're going to see some very difficult times in Iran and much of the rest of the Middle East. So you were asking me about somebody. So this Omar Torrijos, they had a pass that didn't accept what I was doing. He stood his ground. And another president at the same time, Jaime Roldos, democratically elected president of Ecuador, also would run on an anti-oil exploitation campaign. And they both refused to play this game. They refused to go along with me. And both of them died in very suspicious private plane crashes within 3 months of each other. Roldos first, and after Roldos's plane crash. And of course, if you want to assassinate someone, a plane crash is a darn good way to do it, because the smoking gun, it blows up with the plane. Absolutely. Not over the plane, it blows up with the plane. And Roldos his private plane crashed, and Torrijos got all of his family together right after that. And he said, "My brother Jaime was assassinated, and I'll probably be next. But don't worry about me, because I've accomplished what I really needed to accomplish, and that is I successfully negotiated the Panama Canal Treaty with President Carter and turning the Panama over to Panamanians." And sure enough, in a little less than 3 months, he had almost exactly the same fate. His private plane went down almost the same way as Roldos's. And again, no smoking gun, but all the evidence that I've seen and that people collected would indicate that this was not an accident.
Naturally, yeah, it can't be. And it's, I think you're right on the money with that, just given the large coincidence involved there. Would you say that was a specific turning point for you in terms of when you started to sort of wake up to what was going on because of the personal relationship that you had with them?
The real turning point was close to that time, but I took a vacation, and so I had the job for 10 years, and for, I'd say 7, maybe close to 8, I believed that what I was doing was right. And once I began to understand that it wasn't, I didn't want to admit to it, Mickey. And I think this is important. Many people are in this same position today. I was making a lot of money, and I'd grown up, the son of a teacher in a boys' boarding school in New Hampshire. My dad made no money. We had a house given to us by the school. We had food given to us by the school. We didn't want for anything, but we basically had no cash. And I was surrounded by very, very wealthy boys. And I'd heard all these stories about Paris and Buenos Aires and Istanbul and so on and so forth. And I'd always had this desire. Now I'm going to all these places and I'm flying first class and I'm staying in the best hotels and I'm making a good salary. And I don't want to believe what I know to be true. And so for another couple of years, I continued to try to convince myself, and the whole establishment was working to help me convince myself. Every time I would talk to people about leaving, and I would be sent up to what's today known as human resources, and those days was personnel. And I talked to a psychologist who would say, "You're the youngest partner this firm's ever had. You're living the American dream, and we need you, and you need us," and so on and so forth. And then I took a vacation. I rented a small sailboat in the Virgin Islands, and I anchored the boat one night and rowed ashore to St. John Island, climbed up this hill to the ruins of the old sugar plantation. And as I sat there in this beautifully idyllic scene, I'm in this ruins of the sugar cane plantation. It's surrounded by bougainvillea, beautiful flowers, nice aroma, and I'm looking out at the sun setting over the Caribbean, and I think, God, this is the life. This is idyllic. And then it struck me that this plantation had been built on the bones of thousands of slaves. And then I thought, well, damn, the whole continent's built on the bones of millions of slaves, not just from Africa, but indigenous people and so on. And then I said to myself, and John, you too are a slaver. It's a different kind of slavery, but you're enslaving people in debt. And at that moment, I decided, no more, I'll quit. And I went back to Boston at the end of that vacation, and I quit and decided that I would spend the rest of my life using what I knew to try to change the system. And what the system really is we've created this death economy that's polluting and consuming the world right now into extinction. It's polluting itself into extinction and consuming itself. It's depleting in the short term the resources it needs for the long term. It's creating climate change and income inequality, species extinctions, environmental destruction. And, my life today is devoted to trying to transform that, to working to transform that into a life economy, an economic system that pays people to clean up pollution, to rejuvenate destroyed environments, recycle, and create new technologies that don't ravage the earth, and we're headed in that direction with things like solar and wind and many of the other technologies, benefit corporations, B corporations. We are moving in that direction. I think my job today is to keep pushing harder and harder to make that happen.
Absolutely. And you're doing a wonderful job. And by the way, I love everything you said because it got me thinking. I too want to see that type of world. And I speak to a lot of people in the younger generations. And many of us walk around and we almost on a soulful level feel that there's a disconnect between the right things to be doing versus and the way that we make money. And that disconnection is actually growing significantly larger, I would say almost year over year. And, how many people that I've spoken to on a day-to-day where they're just not happy doing what they do for the purpose of making a living. And there's this need, I believe, that we need to get to where we find true alignment with the thing that we're good at, but equally that's good for the environment, the world, and the people around us. But before we move into that direction, I just want to ask you, because so you spent about 10 years working for the private firms, doing the economic hitman job. Obviously, you have these various moments throughout. There's this one moment, like you said, where it sort of hit you and dawned on you that this is it. I got to find a way to get out of this. And so you start to wanting to share your information, your knowledge, and share this with the rest of the world. Most people don't know this. And when you first wanted to write the book, the first book, was there pushback? Did you receive any issues? Did people give you problems? What happened? Was it just easy? Like, hey, I could write about this and it's all good? Or was it almost like a mafia thing where it's like, once you're in, there's no out?
It's like a mafia thing. And
Okay.
I started to write this book as an expose. I wanted to accrue the stories of other economic hitmen, people with jobs like mine, and the jackals. And I started contacting them. And almost immediately I received anonymous phone calls threatening my life and that of my infant daughter. And I took them very seriously. I've seen what these people could do. At the same time, I got taken out to dinner by the president of Stone & Webster, his engineering company, one of the largest engineering companies in the world at the time. And he took me to dinner and he said, you just retired from a job where you were chief economist. It was one of our rivals. Your firm was a rival of ours. You have a great resume. You worked in all these countries. You have all these contacts. We'd like to use your resume in our proposals. You don't have to do any work for us, but just let us use your resume. Oh, we may ask you to fly in our private jet down to Rio de Janeiro or someplace upon occasion to have dinner with a few wealthy people. You don't really have to do anything. Let us use your resume, and I'm prepared to write a check for you as a consultant's retainer tomorrow morning for $500,000. Wow. This is at the end of the 1980s.
Oh boy, yeah.
$500,000 is nothing to sneeze at today, but it was even bigger then. And he said, just don't write the book. So I'm getting what I've been dishing out. I'm getting the carrot.
Getting strongman, basically.
I'm getting the carrot.
Yeah, that's the first.
Spoilers and the pistol. Like if you don't, well, So what would you do?
I mean, I'd probably do what most would do, and I would, just given my family and wanting to keep things going, yeah, I'd probably take it. But that would create, a massive internal struggle for sure.
Well, I did that. And what I did do was I put the money, I didn't buy a big house or fancy cars or something. I put the money to going back to where I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer in the rainforest and forming a couple of nonprofits, Dream Change, and what then became the Pachamama Alliance, which is still very, very active. And started writing books on indigenous cultures, things like The World is As You Dream It, Shape-Shifting, Psychonavigation. Stone & Webster was fine with me doing that. And in other words, I invested this money into things that could help me move forward in the way I wanted to move forward, but without writing the book. Mm-hmm. And then on 9/11, by then my contract with Stone & Webster was done. I was in the Amazon, taking a group of people, and I still take groups of people to these places. And your listeners can go to my website, johnperkins.org, and join me on a trip. And when I flew back to the States, I went up to ground zero. And as I stood looking into that pit, I knew I had to write the book. But this time I decided I wouldn't write it as an expose. I wouldn't tell anybody I was writing. I wouldn't contact anybody. I'd do it completely in secret. I'd write a personal confession, just my story. And I figured that once I had it completely written, no proposals, I wouldn't tell anybody I was writing it, and had it in the hands of a very good New York literary agent, it would be my best insurance policy. Once he got that manuscript out to a bunch of publishers, anybody who really was in this business and wanted to get rid of me would know that it would sell a lot of books. And that's exactly the opposite of what they wanted to do. It has sold well over 2 million books now, but in 38 languages, but it would have sold even more had, it had been killed
absolutely
mysteriously. So I figured it was my insurance policy. So that's how I get the word out.
So once that happens, though, was that it? Was there no attempts thereafter? Everything kind of smoothed out and allowed you to transition out of your old life into now what I believe would be your new life? Or was there something that even happened after that? Was there more pushback that you got?
I think you know the answer to that, but
I'm waiting. Yeah, I'm trying to fish here. I know. I found it wildly interesting, and I think it's a definitely, and I'll tell you why I wanted you to bring it up, because I think that you were challenged, and obviously it seems like you've lived a few lives, and to get to the life that you're in now, it seems that you really, really had to earn it. I mean, it started with the first attempt of them wanting you not to write the book, and then the story you'll probably now share as to what, that should have ended the idea of writing any books. And then you continued and you persevered and you're stronger than ever and speaking freely. And sharing this information. So it took a lot of courage on your part, I would say. But what happened there exactly for those that don't know?
Well, about 3 or 4 months after the book came out and it had gone to the New York Times bestseller list, it ended up staying there for 70-some weeks. I was invited to speak at the United Nations in New York. And I was living in Florida at the time. I flew up to New York on a Monday. I was supposed to speak on Tuesday. And kind of a sketchy journalist had arranged through my publicist to pick me up at the airport and take me to lunch, which he did. And he really asked some stupid, it just was not a very exciting interview. But we had a good lunch. And while I was eating, at one point I got up and went to the restroom, and within a few hours, I had lost more than half the blood in my body, internal bleeding. And I was rushed to Lenox Hill Hospital, where they immediately put transfusions in me. And eventually I took out 70% of my colon, my large intestine, operated and removed it. And it wasn't until after that we began to get emails from people and other journalists came and said, "Don't you know that you were poisoned?" I hadn't, thought about it. At the time, I'd lost just like that. I lost all this blood, internal bleeding. So I went to the doctor who had done the operation and asked him, is it possible I was poisoned? And he said, well, yeah, it's possible, but we've destroyed the evidence. We don't know, because what we do when we do an operation like this is we immediately incinerate. Procedures, you incinerate whatever you take out. We've incinerated it. But the journalist now had disappeared. All that my publicist had was an email address, and it was no longer functional. And besides that, we had no evidence. So I never pursued it very extensively, but I have no doubt that I was poisoned at that point. And I had a friend and I spent 2 weeks in the Lenox Hill Hospital in New York, which was not a particularly pleasant experience. Yeah. But while I was there, I called a friend of mine who was a jackal. And this is a guy I was in a martial artist all my life, and we'd practiced martial arts together, and I knew him quite well. And I asked him, so who do you think did this? And he said, well, I'm pretty sure it wasn't one of the alphabet agencies. That's, the CIA, NSA, FBI. He said, if they had done it, you wouldn't be talking to me. And plus, it doesn't serve their interest to do it. They don't see writers of books as being particularly big threats. They don't want you to sell more of your books. So it's not they would not be in their best interest to get rid of you. I think he was a fanatic, somebody who either didn't like what you did in your life or didn't like the fact you exposed it. I said, well, do you think that he's likely to strike again? And he said, no. And people like that are usually pretty much cowardly. He did a very surreptitious way of poisoning and so forth. It was kind of a cowardly way of doing things. Yeah. And he probably figures he's already given you enough pain and enough problems that he's not going to come back, and probably no one else is. But he said, John, you're going to have to be careful for the rest of your life. But I'll tell you, Mickey, what I fear most is not speaking out. I have a grandson, and I know that for him to inherit a world that he'll want to live in, every child on this planet of all species needs to inherit that kind of a world. And the scary thing to me is to know what I know and do nothing about it. That would, be on my deathbed and look back and say, you chickened out.
Yeah.
That's no good.
Absolutely. And you brought up earlier, so we understand somewhat based on all your stories what the death economy is. But you also speak about the life economy. So how do we get to that? What are some changes that people could look at doing internally first within themselves, but also the world at large? What can we do to sort of progress into that direction, in your opinion?
I go into a lot of detail in this in the Economic Hitman trilogy book. This is a lot in there that deals with what people can do. But as a quick sort of summary, I would say we start with the idea that our reality is molded by our perceptions. There's really no United States and no Canada and no China and no corporations and no culture and no religion except as people perceive them. It has a huge impact on reality. we have been operating under a perception that success as humans means maximizing materialistic consumption and maximizing short-term profits for corporations. That's the driving force. And it is the single biggest thing that's created this death economy, this idea that we have to maximize consumption and short-term profits. So if we can turn that around and say, let's maximize long-term benefits for life and nature, and let's reward the people who do that. So especially look at corporations. What corporations are moving more and more in that direction? And there are quite a few. We've got benefit corporations, B corporations, the idea of conscious capitalism. We've got corporations like HP and a number of other companies that are headed toward doing a better job. I think of Patagonia, for example, is in the clothing industry. None of them are perfect. None of us are perfect. But if we can support the companies that are headed more and more in that direction, that's the route to take. So people can do all kinds of different things to do that. One thing I describe in the book is every one of us can participate in a consumer movement that's on social networks. So pick a corporation that you want to see changed and write them an email like, hey, I love your products, but I'm not going to buy them anymore until you clean up all the pollution you've caused, or pay your workers in Indonesia a fair wage. And send that to their executive, but also send it to all your social networking circles and ask them to send it to all of theirs. And I've talked to a lot of corporate executives, Mickey, who will tell me, I want my company to be greener. I get kids, I get grandchildren, but I know that if I lose market share, my major investors will fire me. But if you get enough people to send a letter like this, that they'll tell me this. I won't read them, but somebody does, and I get a matrix once a month that says what my consumers, my customers, my clients want. And if I get 100,000 of these, I can go to my primary investors and say, hey, we got to listen to our customers. There's power in this. And there's power in expressing this. Look, forget about maximizing short-term profits. Make a little bit of decent profit that you can keep operating, but look to the long-term benefits of people and nature. And, we all can participate in that kind of thing. And then there's examples of many, many other examples in the book. But I would also end with there's 5 questions I think every one of us can ask ourselves, and it doesn't matter what profession or what lifestyle we have. And I go into more detail again in the book on this, but the first question is, what do I most want to do for the rest of my life? What will bring me the greatest satisfaction? And I would answer that by saying, I like to write. I want to keep writing. I love to write. I have a friend who's a carpenter who says, I want to work with my hands in wood, come to the opposite end of the spectrum. Second question is, how do I do this in a way that'll help transform the death economy to a life economy? As a writer, I'd say, I'm going to write about this. I want to inspire people in my writing. And a carpenter friend would say, I'll use only sustainable materials. Third question is, what's stopping me from doing this? What's the blockage that gets in my way from doing this? As a writer, I might say, well, I know to be a good writer, I've got to write every day and I just don't have time. A carpenter friend might say, well, my clients don't want to spend the extra money on sustainable materials. Fourth question, when I confront this blockage, when I really look at it and the perceptions behind it, how can I change my perceptions to move forward? As a writer, I'd say I could turn off the television for an hour or two every night and write. That would give me 7 to 14 hours a week of writing. That's a lot.
Absolutely.
And my carpenter friend would say, well, I'll tell my clients that the extra price is not a cost. It's an investment in the future. And the fifth question is, what actions do I take? As a writer, I have to start writing. I have to write every day or most every day. My carpenter friend has to say, well, I'm going to build this house or this cabinet over here using sustainable materials, and I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to tell everybody, all my clients, that they're investing in the future.
Do you think, but based on everything that you just said, and I agree with that, I would love to see that. But again, if we look at the way the sociology makeup of society is, sociologically speaking, right, and the way we're conditioned with media, with news, social media, and things like that, is it almost safe to say that it feels like we're too far gone, where we're so concerned about the I instead of the we? And if we are, how do we get everybody to sort of take into consideration that we're part of a larger organism and we're part of a larger, broader society that's actually much more connected than we may realize? You know, like, how do we do that?
Well, you hit a really important point that for most of the 200,000 or so years we've seen ourselves as human, we've believed that we were a part of nature, not apart from nature, as indigenous people still believe. But we have come to believe that we are above nature. Supremacy, dangerous thing, that we are not a part of, but are a part from nature. So we really need to turn that around, and nature's teaching us that. You know, climate change, even the pandemic, a little tiny virus has taught us the lesson here, and all the drought and hurricanes and so forth. So we start with that premise that we need to understand that we are not supreme over, that we do not have the luxury of destroying the planet upon which we live in the short term to meet these short-term desires. And also, I think when we ask ourselves these 5 questions, we are being selfish, and it's good selfishness. We're saying, what do I want to do for the rest of my life, and how can I do that in a way that'll help transform the death to a life economy? I'm not asking people to sacrifice what they want to do. I'm saying do what you want to do, but do it in a way that participates in this beautiful movement. We are at a time in history where consciousness is rising. We're in consciousness revolution where we're understanding. I was on a Zoom call earlier today, talking with the University of Connecticut class on this very subject, teaching a class at the University of Connecticut by Zoom. And, 10 years ago and 20 years ago, till fairly recently, I would have had to convince these young people that we actually have crisis. There were big questions. Is it really climate change? Is it really income inequality? You don't have to convince anybody anymore. It doesn't matter what country you're in. I can do the ice gets oxygen all over Europe and China, Asia, Latin America. Everybody gets it. Where we're getting it. The question is, what actions do we take? And that's where you tie in with this. If you get this, then what do you want to do for the rest of your life? And how can you do it in a way that will help turn this thing around?
And I agree with you. But again, to me, I think people have sort of 2 realities, right, in their existence. They have the waking life reality, the monotony of their day-to-day, their life, their job, stuff like that. And then there's that internal world that I think a lot of people have. And that internal world we've almost been conditioned, in my opinion, to turn it off. We don't look to find those types of answers that would take someone could only really find by really looking inside. And so because of that, we're having this reality now where there's such a large disconnect. And there are things that people want to probably do for a living, but have yet to figure out how to make money with it. But it would be interesting to see, because I think the passion that certain people may have for specific things, if they were able to monetize them, they could offer a lot of value, because you want to be passionate about the things that you're doing. But again, there's this disconnect now, and everything is about making money and rising costs and inequality and all these things that are going on. It's killing the dream day by day. And I hate to look at it that way, and I'm not trying to be cynical, but I want to actually touch on something else. So I know you spent a lot of time in the Amazon, and you also have the book, Touching the Jaguar. I've heard you speak on that. I think that book's really interesting, relating to the idea of going with the fears that life may throw your way. That's the part that I think more people need to focus on and connect with. And that can then hold the answers and give them the confidence to push forward with the things that they actually want to do.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the key here is do things you want to do, and it'll bring you joy and satisfaction. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to be successful. And yet I think in almost everything we do, you can do it in a way that will help transform the death economy to a life economy. It doesn't matter whether you're a plumber or a carpenter, as I talked about before, a writer, a podcast host, a teacher, a parent. So we're all consumers. We can consume in that way, a much more conscious way. But it's, it's important that not just that we consume or that we buy the things the right way, but we got to let the companies know, hey, I'm not buying from you because you're polluting too much. I am buying from your competitor, and you let your competitor know I'm buying from you because you're making an attempt. You're working hard to do a better job. I think we can all realize our dreams and do it, but do it in a way that consciously moving toward a life economy. Will we do this or not? My hope is yes, and I think that's my job, and that's your job, is to inspire people, give people the hope that they can do this. It's easy to be negative, and these are self-fulfilling prophecies. If you say I'm going to take a path that leads to higher consciousness and a better way of life, I'm going to do this. I'm on this path. Then you're going to go in that direction. If you say, oh, I can't possibly do any of this, I think I'll just forget about it and continue to destroy the planet and shut myself off and anesthetize myself by drinking alcohol or taking drugs, smoking marijuana, whatever. Then you're going to go downhill. But I think enough people today are really understanding. And I taught at this MBA program in Shanghai, China, a few years back, and I was really taken by these students in this program who have been designated to be China's future leaders. And they one of the things that they said is that we've created an economic miracle here in China, and it's come at a horrible price, environmentally and socially. But now we're going to create an environmental and social miracle. And they said, we understand we've lived with terrible pollution. You guys in the United States, you haven't experienced that. And a number of these students had been to undergraduate work in the United States. And they said, you just haven't experienced this. OLA experienced a little bit of it, but we've experienced it big time. And we don't want this for our children and grandchildren. And I think the world is beginning to see this, making more and more that we can't go on like this, and people are getting it. It takes time, but we're moving in that direction. And we are moving more increasingly toward a life economy. I truly believe, I know companies that are headed in that direction, that are really looking very seriously at this.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that. And I like the concept of raising our frequency and vibration and sort of growing our consciousness, because that's what it would take. And it feels like the last few years specifically, just with everything that's happened, the world's become very polarized, very sort of us versus them. And I can tell you from my own experience and from others that I speak to, it feels like we're missing something. We're missing soul. It almost feels like, we're craving it, but we don't know where to get it. And just speaking to your experiences, by the way, are there tips, tricks? Are you a fan of meditation? I feel like you might be. I don't know. Are you? Okay,
sure.
Cool.
Yeah.
It's helped you?
Yeah, absolutely. Meditation, prayer, dreams. I took a group to northern India a few years back, and we spent an afternoon in the Dalai Lama's living room with him, talking with him. And one of the people asked him the question, said, there's a writer in the United States who's calling on people to take 10 minutes off one day, a particular day, and pray for peace. What do you think of that, Your Holiness? The Dalai Lama said, well, praying for peace, meditating on peace, that's a good thing. But if it's all you do, it's a waste of time and probably counterproductive. Because if you walk away from meditating on peace or praying for peace and you say, I've done my job, you're counterproductive. You haven't. And he said, you have to take daily action to make peace happen. Your own personal peace as well as global peace. Daily action. And I think, the Dalai Lama is a great manifestation of that. He meditates for several hours every day, and then he goes out and writes books or travels around the world on a speaking tour. I think we can all learn from that. Yes, I think meditation is very important, and then take it the next step and take actions. And, these days an action can be one email every day, or, a tweet or whatever you happen to do. It can be that easy. That's, you can take 3 minutes to do it, or you can run for public office or whatever. There's all sorts of different directions, and each individual needs to look to his or hers. And, I'd finish this whole conversation by saying, I think we should all feel very, very blessed that we live at this time, because we're on the cusp of human evolution. We are evolving. And
Yes.
will we evolve enough? I don't know. But we're in the process. We're understanding that we have not reached the end all. We've got to evolve better. And so we're faced with lots of crises and challenges, but tremendous opportunities to move into a new understanding of what being human beings on this earth means being.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that you said that. It really does feel that we're pretty much at the doorstep of either an incredibly bright future, just given everything that we have around us that could be seized as an opportunity, or if, we continue to sort of take a passive approach as we've done in the past, then unfortunately it may not be that bright. So it's almost like we have no choice. And just again, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it. I've been a fan of yours, like I said, for several years. I want to make sure as many people as possible read the book, see the videos. Where can people find you? And before that, actually, what would be, I like to ask this question. So next 5 years, let's say, what's the vision for you? What's next?
For me personally?
For you personally.
I'll keep writing and speaking about these things. Maybe the next one will be a science fiction novel about, I haven't decided. I just finished this last book and I'm still on this sort of engagement. I'm speaking, I've got 4 places I'm speaking this next summer in Europe on this, and I've got a lot on the plate for the next year. But yeah, I'll keep writing because that's what I like to do. And the best place for people to get in touch with me is my website, johnperkins.org. Please put your email address in the little subscribe box, and you'll get my newsletter once a month. It'll tell you where I'm going to be. I travel, and I'd love to meet some of your listeners and get together with them. So please go to johnperkins.org, put your name in there, and you can always buy the book too. That'll
Absolutely
give you more information. And if you like it, please write a review.
They definitely will. You have my word. I'm going to put all links to the website, to the book, and everything below. And once again, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure, and I'm wishing you all the very best.
So